Welcome to The Point of View. This is your favorite current affairs show here on Channel 1 Television. On The Point of View, we pick the right topics, get the right guests, ask them relevant questions on issues that matter to you. Tonight, we are going big on the United States. Donald Trump is 47th. He was 45th. He's now 47th. So we have two big questions for the night. How did he win, and what does this mean for the world? I have a very powerful panel. I'll tell you more when I come back. Stay with us. So tonight I'll be picking three perspectives on Donald Trump's historic return to the White House. I'll be speaking to the Voice of America's Anita Powell. She is a correspondent who's based in Washington. The VOA have been with us throughout this coverage, and Anita is happy to join us. Anita, thanks for joining us. Good evening.
Good evening.
Before I ask my first question, let me just also introduce my other guest. I have David Fosu-Dorte, who is a geopolitical analyst. He runs a Pan-African law firm, AB and David. Later on, I'll speak to political scientist and democracy expert, Professor Bafo Agyemangbe as well. So, Anita, let's start with Washington. The mood there now and how the White House is receiving this remarkable or almost surprising for some, this news that Donald Trump is going to be in the White House from 20th January.
Right. So I spent all of yesterday at the White House, and it was quiet. I think the mood was very muted and quiet because, of course, Joe Biden was not participating as a candidate in this election. So far, he hasn't said anything today, and we haven't heard either from Vice President Harris on her defeat in this election. So I think the words that I might use are quiet, cautious, and muted. Though, of course, as I think anybody knows, Washington, D.C. and its environs are a Democratic stronghold. So the mood among the citizenry here is, of course, what you would expect. People are disappointed, people are upset. And I think this is illustrative of something that's very familiar to those of us who have lived in Africa for a long time, which is the urban-rural divide. We often see results go one way in the urban centers and differently in less populated areas. And that is what we have seen here with this decisive victory by Donald Trump last night.
The build up to this was described as too close to call. In fact, some people said this was the closest election that had been polled. The numbers were very even. But from looking at the results, it appears this is almost like a strong victory for Trump, and it wasn't as close as was being projected. Is that the feeling, and am I misinterpreting the way the victory has been decisive?
So yes and no. You are right that the polls showed that this was statistically too close to call, but the pollsters also said it is possible we will have a decisive victory. And it's difficult mathematically to reconcile both of those, and that is because I think we're still learning why this played out the way it did. But we did have a clear victor, and that may feel surprising to certain people, but that is what pollsters were saying all along, that ahead of the polls it was too close to call, but that didn't mean that they were going to end up tied in the polls, that one side might eke out a victory. And that's exactly what happened last night. The people of America spoke. They spoke decisively, and in many places where I think many people, observers, were expecting to see Harris do better, she didn't. There was a clear rightward shift, and that's reflected not just in the presidential race, but also in the lower ballots, in the down ballot races. We saw Republicans pick up seats in the Senate and in the House. So I guess this is indicative of a very clear, small rightward shift in the United States, and this remains a very deeply divided country.
The so-called blue wall collapsed because if we look at the so-called swing states, when the results started coming in, of course, Georgia is not part of the blue wall, but obviously right. Philadelphia was, Pennsylvania, forgive me, was pretty big. North Carolina also went to Trump, which is one of the swing states, and then Wisconsin. Are you able to explain how come at least 4 or 5 of the 7 so-called swing states all, as of now, fell to Trump?
Well, the reasons are different for all 7 of the swing states. You mentioned a few of them. Just to give some examples from what we've seen today, Dearborn, Michigan, which is a very diverse community with many Arab Americans, went towards Trump. Now, I'm not sure at this hour if we can say that this is because of opposition to the Biden administration's support of Israel, But I think that was a very big factor in Michigan voters, who were the home base of the quote unquote abandoned Biden movement, which was when he was still the candidate. This was opposing his support of Israel in the conflict in the Middle East. That was definitely an element. But in other swing states, we're still parsing those results. And I've identified like 4 factors that I think kind of moved voters in the polls. And one is just, how do you feel about Donald Trump? Because the thing is, nobody in America feels neutral about Donald Trump. I think that's very clear. So that was element number 1. Element number 2, how do you feel about the first female president? Nobody feels neutral about that either. Number 3, how do you feel about reproductive rights and abortion? That's another issue that's very divisive. And the last one was conflict in Gaza. So that influenced a lot of voters, but it's not clear whether in those swing states you mentioned, whether voters were swayed more by one or the other.
You alluded to the urban-rural divide. Again, from an outside perspective, there seem to be about 4 or 5 fault lines. Rural, Trump; urban, Kamala; old Trump, young Kamala; women, Kamala; men, Trump. And the list goes on. College-educated, Kamala; non-college educated, Trump. Is it as clearly delineated as this, or am I being oversimplistic in giving these broad differences?
I mean, that's a very nice generalization, but I do think that that's probably simplistic. This is a very large country with 330 million people, very rapidly changing. So I think that is a good broad strokes analysis that you've just given, but I could see that falling apart because Americans are not a monolith. I think we've seen that. This is a country where we say that diversity is our strength, and it also leaves us without convenient explanations for everything. So I that's good broad strokes, but I think I could probably find a voter within 5 minutes who would poke a hole in that argument.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Still on the matter of broad strokes, again, we were told economy, immigration, abortion. Was that were those the 3? And in your view, how did that play out in the end?
I think we're going to need a little bit more time to figure that one out, because, as I said, again, American voters are not monolithic, and they don't necessarily vote straight ticket. It's not uncommon for an American voter to choose a president from one party and a senator from a different party. So I think we're going to learn more about that in the coming days, weeks, months, maybe years. But that's again very broad strokes that you've just painted there.
There are some who feel that if Kamala had had a longer time to campaign, she probably would have done better. I know it's very early days yet, but that's a feeling some people are getting, that, well, look, she came in last minute, she got the bump, but she didn't have enough time to impose herself on the race. And so there's a whole conversation around, should the Democrats have given her an earlier chance? Should President Biden have given in earlier? Any indication of what's going on within the Democratic team around that?
I expect that there's a lot of this, what we would call in the United States, Monday morning quarterbacking, or, the Monday morning analysis of why the match didn't go your way. Should the goalie have blocked differently? I mean, come on, that's going to be the conversation that we're having in the United States in coming days, weeks, and months. But yeah, it was admittedly a very, very fast campaign. She did not have a clearly delineated policy on several things. And I guess Americans were maybe shaken by the change at the top of the ticket. She didn't face a primary. She hadn't been tested in that way. But, there were a lot of elements in voters' minds, and I can't see into the heart of the minds of all 160 million or so voters who made this choice and restored Donald Trump to the presidency.
But how unusual have all the circumstances been? So the Biden stepping down, Kamala coming in, Trump shot once, another attempt on his life. I mean, it's been a very crazy, I don't know, you've covered elections for a while. Have you had an election with this level of, I don't know what to call it, uncertainty in terms of how volatile the environment has been?
Certainly not an American election, no. But I've covered, I think by my count, 19 African elections. And, drama and politics go hand in hand. I am struggling. I mean, your country, Ghana, is, of course, the the first country to declare independence. You've had very stable governance for your many years, but in other parts of the world, this isn't abnormal. This is a feature, not a bug. This hasn't been a feature in the United States election, but I would also remind you that we have very dense and close coverage of our political machinations in this country. And you're hearing about it because we have, as journalists, a lot of reach. But no, I think it is fair to say this has been an extremely dramatic, unpredictable race. But I would just highlight one very important thing. Security officials have said this morning that they believe that this election was largely without any drama or trauma, without any interference. It was free and fair. The institutions held. We haven't seen widespread violence. We haven't seen any sort of mass voter intimidation. So the institutions held, and I think I would remind everybody that that is very important. That it is morning in America, but it is a peaceful morning in America, and I think that's very important.
Just a final thought on Trump and what he will mean for America. So I put a lot of questions into one. Do you get a sense that Trump 2 will be different from Trump 1? Are we going to get a more refined Trump? Is it going to get worse? What does the expert view think about what kind of Trump we're going to get from January 20 next year?
So I would hesitate to put it in normative terms like worse or better. Trump is definitely a very interesting individual who shoots from the hip, as he likes to say, governs from the gut, however you want to put it. But a presidency is not just one person, one man in this case. It is an administration. And so I fully expect that a second Trump term will be very different from a first Trump term, in that he has possibly a lot more infrastructure, possibly a lot less family members involved in the administration this time. We haven't seen his eldest daughter anywhere in this campaign. So I think there will be clear differences, and I think in some ways the policies that have been outlined by his supporters, namely in the Project 2025 handbook, which he has of course disavowed, there's a roadmap for implementation, whereas in his first term there wasn't a roadmap for implementation of all of his ideas. So I think we might see a more determined administration with a little bit more policy chops than we saw last time. And we've heard his policies, we've heard his views, but also it's Trump, and wherever he goes, he brings a lot of drama, a lot of attention, a lot of heat. And so I think we can expect that, which is very much like his first term in office.
I'd like to thank you and congratulate your team for providing us such excellent coverage, and also for taking time to talk to us throughout the process. We're very grateful for the partnership. And I think you guys should take a deserved rest after, I don't know after how many hours, 48, I don't know. So well done, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. And yes, thank you so much.
So that was Anita Powell. She's a White House correspondent for Voice of America. She actually was in the White House throughout. She says a very somber mood. We haven't heard yet from President Biden. Neither have we heard from Vice President Kamala Harris, nor from Tim Walz. So be sure that when they speak, she would be there to report. And those of you who don't know, VOA partner us here at Channel 1, and they've been reporting for us, helping us to get a clearer sense of the U.S. election. We'll take a breather. When we come back, we'll come back home. I'll be speaking to David Ofosu-Dorte, who accurately, with a caveat, predicted this when I interviewed him earlier in the year. He will tell me how he saw it coming. And then I'll speak to Professor Bafo Agyemang-Duah as well on what this means for the world system, governance, democracy, and the rest of them. Stay with us. Welcome back. The point of view tonight is asking two questions. Donald Trump is now 47th. He was 45th. He's back as U.S. president. He takes office January 20. How did he do it, and what does it mean? So on the how did he do it part, I just finished talking to Anita Powell, who's the Voice of America White House correspondent. She was in the White House throughout. She says the mood is somber. She also says that even though the polls predicted a close race, they also did say that because of the margin of error, a strong victory for either candidate could not be ruled out. So we can't really say the polls were wrong. Let me come to David Ofosu-Dorte. He is I call him a geopolitical analyst and founder of a Pan-African law firm. David, thanks for joining us. Good evening.
Good evening, Bernard. Thanks for inviting me.
I don't know whether it was January or February, but we had you on air some time back, and I wanted my producer to even play what you said. But if I remember, you said that if Donald Trump gets the Republican nomination, he has an advantage to win the election. But because at the time there was a lot of legal issues and he hadn't yet been given the nomination. But you said that if he did get the nomination, he would win. Am I quoting you correctly?
Yes, you are. I mean, I think at that time, the Milwaukee Convention was yet to be held. And what I did say is that by July, I expected Nikki Haley to drop out of the race. And then I expected that he will win. Of course, because of the legal battles, it was uncertain as to whether the legal battles was going to prevent him from still going on the ticket. And my prediction was that if he actually went on the ticket, the odds favored him and he was more likely to win.
At the time, did we know what Biden was going to do? Because I think he also said something about Biden and his weakness. But we did not know. What was the prediction on Biden?
Well, I didn't predict Biden would drop out, but I said by August, Biden may probably look so weak that the chances of his winning were likely to dwindle. Of course, as we know, that also appeared to have happened, and he dropped out of the race. At that time of the prediction in January, I wasn't expecting Biden not being on the ballot, but I expected him to be on the ballot and look very, very weak, as it were. He dropped out. But I always expected that once Trump got on the ballot, he was likely to be the next president.
And I think the first debate exposed the Biden situation, right? Because I think it was that debate that led to his replacement. So, in a sense, his weakness was exposed by the debate, which then led to his dropping out.
The weakness I was referring to was more of his age and physical outlook than the debate. Of course, the debate heightened it because of the performance. But I think Biden was beginning to look weak from the latter part of last year, and many pundits doubted his ability to survive a very hectic race. As you may recall, when he dropped out, Kamala gathered quite a lot of momentum, and there were many who thought that she could win based on the momentum. But that momentum was temporary. The race itself has had a bit of ups and downs. The attempted shooting or the shooting at Donald Trump himself at some point appeared to have given an extra boost to Trump. And then came in Kamala. And then, of course, it was very clear as the polls were looking tighter that the race was still that of Trump to win more than any other year.
Okay, so now Trump has won. I mean, what are the implications of a Trump presidency for the geopolitical order? Maybe that's my opening question about his victory.
For once, let me separate the geopolitical implications from what these days are called the geostrategic implications. The geopolitical implications, of course, relate to the likes of NATO and expansion, or the NATO's position on the Ukraine-Russian war, and what it will mean. Of course, Trump has already signaled his intentions to, as much as possible, end the war as soon as possible. I'm not so sure as whether that would mean ceding territory by Ukraine. So that's one aspect to look at. And then, of course, the Middle East, where I don't expect much change in policy, even though I'm not so sure whether the relationship with Netanyahu will remain as strong as it was in Biden's first term. Then you have the China bit about it. Overall, from a geopolitical point of view, I think America's position towards geopolitics generally, in terms of its sphere of control and its position of being the leader of the free world and all those things that come with it, I don't think anything will change. I think that is going to remain largely the same. Trump may be less likely to go to war in that regard. So from that point of view, but I'm more interested in the geostrategy point of it as to what it means both to nations, to Africa, and to the economies of the world. And that's when you bring in the likes of China, tariffs, which he has promised. So that may sound like geopolitics, but these days it's more of geostrategy. Tariffs on China goods are likely to come up. The likes issues relating to Huawei and the likes are likely to come up. Remember, we have the BRICS also positioning itself in the de-dollarization attempt. But what you should look at when it comes to that, and with geostrategy, I want to add it to the economics. Just look at exactly what has happened immediately. The victory was announced. Wall Street is performing better. All the indices are going up. The dollar has strengthened basically overnight. What that means simply is that there is confidence in the economy, and oil prices have remained low. That's the immediate response that you should be looking at. And I expect a return of a higher rate of confidence in the American economy. What that will mean is whether countries which were seeking to de-dollarize will remain to de-dollarize. And those are the kind of things we need to look at. Then you have to look at it from the point of view of Europe. Again, if you recall the predictions I was making during the crystal ball, I was talking about Europe perhaps being more afraid than many countries in the Americas itself. Europe is more, as it were, susceptible to China's changes in policy than they were previously, and perhaps it will be worse under Trump. And Europe will have to confront a reform in its approach to economy in terms of industrialization in a new AI-led economy, which is essentially led by America and China. So those are some of the things that will affect the geostrategy I'm talking about. But I can't leave this without talking about this impact on Africa.
Before you go there, on the economy, it's true that the stock market has picked up. Even Bitcoin, the most popular crypto, also went up. So generally, economic sentiment is high. But if we look at his promised economic policies, yes, tax cuts are good for companies. He also is interested in drilling oil, so the oil and gas sector will probably grow. Mm-hmm. But his trade war with China, the literature on these trade wars does not necessarily bode well for global economy, right? When the two superpowers ban each other's products or impose tariffs around 60%, it doesn't necessarily bring prices down. So it could actually lead to inflation. So my point is that the jury is out there on the overall effect of his economic policies on the world economy. While some things may be good, it could also lead to challenges for the rest of the world because what do you call it? A protectionist economic policy by the world's largest economy is not necessarily a good thing for economic growth.
I agree with you 100%. It is not, and you have to look at it from two angles. One is its effect on the American economy itself, and that American world, especially those who are outside America. I believe part of our inflation is imported from the US and other countries like that. So definitely, yes, it has an impact. But you have to look at it also from what impact it has. I think, for example, the previous tariffs imposed, which Biden incidentally continued and even attempted to increase some just recently, is part of the contributory factor to the inflation within the American economy, of course, including the Ukraine war, which led to part of the challenges that the ordinary voter sees. And in the long run, all politics is local. So it affects the American economy first. Then the global economy, it may lead to either counter tariffs on the part of China, which is obvious. And then, of course, the decoupling, as some people have called it, where banning China as Huawei and also even access to nanotechnology and chips have led to a situation where China is now developing its own 5G chips and things like that. So it may not necessarily lead to what is expected. However, there are two things which is important when it comes to Trump's tax cuts and tariffs and all that. it may lead to the making of new deals. And that's one thing we should not rule out. Look at the fact that Trump, in his first term, notwithstanding all his purported belligerent attitude, went to China, sat down with persons who may ordinarily be seen to, as opposed to him, and he is capable of making deals. That's the kind of thing I expect. As we speak, China and the US are still the largest trading partners to each other. 540 billion worth of goods were traded between them, notwithstanding the tariffs. So I think that in the long run, they may end up making a deal between them. What we also need to look at is how China, for example, will counterbalance it in terms of looking at other trade options, particularly Southeast and Northeast Asia. Remember, the regional economic partnership in Asia has kicked off. So China may be looking at other ways of selling its products to the rest of the world.
My final question is on Africa. The impression I get is that, I mean, Africa has become quite low on the US foreign policy agenda, even from Biden. He hadn't visited here, at least up until that, I don't know. So essentially, I'm not sure if Trump necessarily worsens US attention on Africa. And I know whether that's a good or bad thing. What are your thoughts around how Africa should react to a Trump presidency?
Oh, that's another matter altogether. Again, from a geopolitics point of view, Africa gets involved in one way or the other, and maybe, as it were, influenced to support one side of the divide or the other. Remember, the last Africa-US summit, I think, was in 2019. Trump, in his first term, held one as well, where even the names of some African countries were difficult for him to pronounce. I remember Namibia as an example. But America has tried to counter China with its own version of the FOCAC promise, promising 63 billion dollars in terms of investments. It hasn't happened yet. Remember AGOA also, which hasn't performed as well as one is expected. AGOA comes to an end in 2025 and may need to be renewed. What I think Africa can do is, instead of watching from a geostrategic point of view, Africa should, from a geopolitics point of view, Africa should take a geostrategic position. There are two things which has happened that used not to be the case when Trump was first in power. There wasn't actually AFCFTA fully rolled out, so Africa didn't have a collective strategy. The Africa mining vision had also not been rolled out fully. This time, quite a number of countries have got value addition policies, etc. But if we could come together, then the likes of Congo DR, which controls a significant part of the cobalt market, and the likes of countries like Zimbabwe, Ghana, etc., which have lithium, and who may be able to leverage that, may be able to negotiate with America, and particularly for a president who is a deal maker, I think this may be the time for Africa to think about making a deal just for purposes of being a deal maker. Trump, I believe, may be ready to make a deal with Africa if we will act as one. But if we continue to act individually the way we have done, we may be worse off.
Thank you, David Ofosu-Dorte, who's a geopolitical analyst and founder of the law firm AB and David. When we come back, we'll speak to Professor Bafo Agyeman-Duah, who is really, I mean, you can call him an expert on democracy, good governance. And what does Mr. Trump leading the U.S. mean for democracy and all of those things that we so dearly cherish? Stay with us. Welcome back. So the point of view tonight has two questions with three guests. So how did Trump win and what does his victory mean? I started with our VOA correspondent for the White House, and then I also spoke to David Ofosu-Dorte on the geopolitical economic issues. Now, Professor Bafo Agyeman-Duah is a pioneer of democracy in terms of the thinking around it in this part of the world, and he's our guest for the rest of the show to help us make sense of what this means for good governance, democracy, and the progress and all those beautiful things we also much cherish. Prof, thanks for joining us. Good evening.
Good evening, and thanks for having me.
I'm sure you've been watching the election. What did you make of the whole election, and how surprised are you that number 45 is now number 47?
Then I tell you, I was stunned when the results started coming in. And right away, it became clear that Donald Trump might have the upper hand. I think a lot of people have been terribly disappointed, not because Trump has necessarily won, but the character that has won the election leaves a lot to be desired. And you are talking about me going to talk about democracy. We'll come there. So my initial reaction was simply stunned. I just couldn't believe what I was hearing and what I was seeing on television. And I think a lot of people were. Because here is a person whose character and record would not recommend him to be even a headmaster in any decent public school, in the United States in particular, and in anywhere else in the world. Someone who has about 33 or so convictions, someone who as president was impeached two times, someone whose language is always foul, someone who always speaks and put people down. I mean, I can go on and on. So such a character to be affirmed by Americans in this election clearly tells me that maybe democracy has no room for good character, and therefore anybody such as Trump could be president. But that was the decision of the collectives we call the Americans. So they will have to live with it. So my initial impression is a disappointment. And I think Trump, I don't know how he's going to be around for 4 years and how that is going to impact all of us. And I'm sure that if Ghana wants to be democratic, as we're aspiring to be, that part of leadership is not what we want in our system.
So I was listening to an analysis on the BBC earlier when one of the commentators made the exact point you made about character of the leader. And the counterpoint from the other side was, well, if we want to go into the personal lives of our politicians, it will be very difficult to get anybody who's without fault. And then the person also said, maybe voters were more interested in what the person will do by way of policy than on their personal problems. This was the retort of the person on the other side of that interview in the morning. What do you make of that?
The first argument certainly is an important one. I do agree that we don't have to go into the private lives of people, but we are talking about cases that are public. If Donald Trump had dated 20,000 women, that's up to him. It's no crime. But when it comes to public, that you have abused women, you've gone to court and you've been adjudged guilty, that is public. Sure. When you are impeached 3 times as president, it's public. So we're talking about leadership that has that public side. So I think it's important, because if that secret side becomes public, in my view, morality is jettisoned. Good character is jettisoned. And that is not a model of leadership that anybody would like to recommend, not even for a high school headmaster, you see, or even a teacher. So for those who think that this is nothing, I beg to differ. I think leadership has multiple sides. For older people who are in leadership, they must also know that the younger people are looking at them. They listen to them. They read about them. So if a leader of the most, quote-unquote, most powerful country in the world had this kind of trait, is that what we are asking our young people to learn? No. So whilst I understand that there's no angel in this world, and all of us have skeletons in our closet, I'm sure if it wasn't Donald Trump, if I had been a Democrat with that kind of record, there is no way, absolutely no way Americans will have voted for it. Because you see, here we're talking about the dominance of evangelicals who claim to be preaching the Bible. And the Bible, I believe, speaks against all these traits in character, and yet they all supported him. So there's an inherent, what we call hypocrisy in those people who claim to be pastors or whatever. And then, that's the reality, my brother.
Is it not? That's an interesting angle. Some would say that maybe the what they would call the absurd rush towards over-liberalization in social issues, LGBTQ being an example, the abortion issues and their view on right to life, maybe at the core of their support for Trump is the fact that here is somebody who can win, who they believe will champion their version of what is morally right, because it's clearly a question of moral relativity, right? Some say...
Correct.
So it looks like people weigh different moral issues, and for them, abortion, same-sex marriage rank higher than the other things you described about Mr. Trump, which probably is the unspoken part of this quite overwhelming victory for him, and also the support he seems to have even in Africa. Because on my radio show yesterday, I asked people to randomly send me who they thought would win, and a comfortable 9 out of 10 said they preferred Trump. So maybe people are looking at different things.
Yes, you're right. All of us look at different things. We don't look at the same thing at the same time, even though we have the same kind of eyes. So I'm not surprised by that. And again, my argument might be moot anyway, because certainly morality has never won anywhere where we're talking about raw politics. And even popular opinion, the recent Afrobarometer indicated that Ghanaians are looking for good character and integrity in our leaders. I wonder if any of the 13 or so individuals who are competing to be president of our country, solidly speaking, do they both read that? Because they are no angels. So I do understand that perfectly well. But where a leader has been convicted in court, properly constituted, we're talking about rule of law, pending judgment. I mean, I don't know. But let's put that aside.
Yeah, let's move on. Let's move on.
Yes.
So what I want to find out for you is America is perceived as the quote-unquote leader of the free world. But this president is considered a unilateralist, pulls out of the Paris Agreement, and is quite unorthodox in his style.
Yes.
Europe is pretty nervous. Where do you think the world is? And by that as well, America also used to be the world's policeman. Of course, they are not always very honest about this, because in some places they support dictators and they pick and choose. But the point is, with Trump as president, how does that impact the world order?
Seriously, I see Trump potentially rearranging the world order according to his image. Trump is not only a unilateralist, he's also anti-globalist. He sees America at the center of everything. America first, it is his mantra. And the current world order, as constituted, is something he may wish to unravel. Of course, there are new forces in the international arena. The China is look, you mentioned, when he was president, first term, he even was chastising NATO, threatening to withdraw from NATO. That's where the unilateralism comes in. At the same time, it also reflects anti-globalism. So where will he stand there? It's a very interesting thing for analysts, because on one hand, and I heard my good friend David talk about geostrategic and geopolitics and geostrategy. The thing is, first of all, contrary to American policy of long-standing, which is wanting to be the leader and therefore leading every possible global movement, supporting it in different ways, Trump rather sees in these things what is best for America. And the word transactional has been used to characterize the way he deals with things. David used the term dealing. He's a dealer. In fact, his whole life has been nothing but dealing. So if globalism will make America great, to use his own term, I'm sure he will approach it from a perspective that will make America great. Not necessarily what will be mutually beneficial for all of us, you see. And that's the danger. If you bring African to the picture, I'm not quite sure how he's going to deal with us. In his first tenure, certainly he presided over All Africa meeting at the White House. But look, he was nudged by people. And even we didn't see anything coming out of that. But I think so far as the power of China, if he's unable to have a deal with China, and China is going to continue who's spread around Africa and elsewhere, then it's going to make Africa more of a pawn in global politics, where these big powers will still be using Africa as a pawn, and therefore we've been on the chessboard for these powers to play with us. So for me, the lesson here we must learn is for Africans to begin to rethink this notion of African after we have done after. By still reeling, NAFTA hasn't picked up steam. So we need to be serious with that, and more in terms of where we can unify our efforts. Because look, we have been treated this way for centuries. And once we do not develop a mind that says, look, we need to begin to have dignity, self-respect, and therefore build our own base for development. And we stop going to IMF to queue, to be called for 20 minutes and to be dismissed. There was this thing, I'm sure you saw it on social media, where the Kenyan minister went back after this recent IMF meeting and came back saying he was embarrassed because African finance ministers were made to line up on a corridor. They call you in 20 minutes, your case is done, treating them like schoolboys with no respect. And that's exactly what happens to you if you continue to hope that your destiny can be determined by external forces, in this case, America and these IFIs in the world. So I think the challenge for us as Africans, as Ghanaians in particular, is to begin to rethink how we relate to the external world. We have to find a way to delimit our dependency on the global system. We have to find a way to delimit our dependency on foreign charity. These are the issues, okay? So if we are going to bemoan our situation, I will say, look, don't let us agonize over this, but let us organize.
Wonderful.
Let's stop agonizing and let's organize.
I think that's a very neat way of putting it, and I think that's a very great place to end this. We're still all reflecting on this, so I thank you for, I'll call this your initial reactions. We hopefully have many more days to discuss the world order.
Sure.
So thank you, Prof. Good to see you again. Professor Bafa Jemandria, I call him one of the democracy pioneers in terms of the thinking around it, co-founder of the CDD, now does a lot of work within the international space, speaking to us. Earlier on, we had David Ofosu-Dote, who's a geopolitical analyst and also the founder of ABN. David, and early on in the show, I had Anita Powell, who's the Voice of America's White House correspondent, speaking to us from Washington on Donald Trump comes back as US president. How did he do it, and what does this mean for the rest of us? Thanks for watching. See you next time. Bye-bye.